Back in January 2023, I made a video series of me trying to unstick my novel project. At that point, I'd been working on my novel for over 2 years, and I hadn't been able to finish a draft in a while. My first draft was the discovery draft, and it's the only one that I'd written that got all the way through to the end. But even so, it was really short, and I wrote it in fountain pen in a notebook. Since then, I'd made various attempts to finish another draft, and I kept running into questions and story problems. In the winter of 2021, I sat down and made a concerted effort to world build. It turned out a lot of the things that were sticking me in my project were world building questions. So don't let anyone tell you that world building is always procrastinating. In my case, it was the other way around. I was procrastinating answering world building questions by trying to make more and more drafts. So sitting down and brainstorming those questions and making a series wiki unstuck me for a while. But then, by winter of 2022, I started getting stuck again. By the way, I realized I haven't said much about my novel. It's fantasy, and it has nature and coming of age themes, and a pretty subtle magic system. That's all I'll say about it for now. So I'd figured out one source of my stuckness, which was the world building questions, and those were becoming clearer. I also had a pretty good sense of my main characters, but I was still getting stuck. In December 2022, I set myself a month-long challenge that I gave an unpronounceable name to that I immediately regretted. But anyway, I did make a YouTube series about it, and I was able to unstick myself and get a much better sense of the story using a question and answer format where I kept analyzing my story by asking myself more and more questions, and by drawing. This project was actually hugely successful, and I would recommend doing something similar if you're ever stuck and if you're like me and you're kind of visual or you think in questions. So I ended that video series by saying this. Thanks for following along. I'll be back eventually with something, TBD, but I will be back at some point with novel updates. Alright then, bye! So I guess now is the sometime, and this is the something, a year and a half later. That's probably what I meant all along. So I started 2023 all full of clarity and excitement and the satisfaction of having finished this project. So I kept going with the drafting even though my monthly challenge was done. And I was making progress, mainly in terms of translating all the plot details that I'd figured out into draft material. But believe it or not, I was starting to get stuck again. In fact, I end on this optimistic exclamation point, but I didn't come back to this for months. That was partially because I had something exciting happen. One of my applications to give a TEDx talk was accepted, and so I went to San Antonio to do that. It was about climate and creativity, and so its themes were kind of connected to the themes of my novel. But anyway, when I got back from that, I was all pumped up about the nonfiction side of my work, and so I didn't really come back to the novel for a while. I was doing a bunch of other things. I was writing blog posts and articles. I was doing a whole lot of nature stuff. And so I feel like I was growing a lot as a writer, even though I wasn't doing much fiction writing. I was starting to get good at note-taking. You might have noticed I was using Notion for tracking my novel writing progress in the beginning. Around this time, I started using Obsidian, and for my blogs, I had to organize a lot of research. And there was something about this time. I was collecting all these notes and making indexes for them and organizing the folders, and something clicked, because a novel is such a big project, and I feel like I didn't have a way to think about it. I didn't have a way to hold all the ideas in my head. And so I was getting practice just tackling big projects in general and collecting a whole lot of ideas and making sense of them. And something about that led to late 2023, I had this sudden insight of like, hey, I think I know how to finish this novel. And I didn't even know anything specific, but suddenly it just felt a lot more tractable than it had in a long time. So in late 2023, I started making time for my novel project again. And I started by organizing all my notes, putting them into an outline, even a chapter-wise outline, believe it or not. In some ways, this is the most organized I'd ever been in this project, but also it wasn't really that organized. And I started using some of the old techniques that had worked for me. I started drawing and making concept art of, characters and places and things. I started asking myself questions and finding the places in the story where I had the least clarity and spending focused brainstorming sessions on each of those. Free writing, dictating memos, writing with fountain pen again, figuring out how I like to draft. As it happens, I use Apple Pages, and I make a zillion different files. I make one file for each chapter. So, in January 2024, I finally felt ready to draft. I had the beginning of the story down. The events of that part were staying unchanged from one of my previous drafts, but I had a whole lot more detail, a much clearer picture in my mind while I wrote it, and all the world building details down. This was an exciting time, because I was figuring out how I like to draft. As it turns out, I like to write a chapter, editing slightly as I go, and then when I get to a new chapter, I start a new file, and I keep going until I get stuck. And then I go back and I do a round of edits on the existing chapters, sometimes cycling over the same chapter a bunch of times. I think that's why I like having the separate files. And then at some point, I write my file to a PDF and then I mark it up using a stylus. That's what I'm doing here. And anyway, this part was super exciting because I could see the story getting better, and I could see that each chapter actually sounded like a chapter. One of the things I forgot to mention is that around this time I was reading a lot. I joined a couple of book clubs and set myself some personal reading projects, and I was reading a whole lot of fiction and nonfiction. And something about that was making fiction writing feel more accessible. Like, the words were just words and the paragraphs were just paragraphs. And I could see that I was getting closer and closer to what I consider good fiction writing. Good enough, I need to like it before anyone else does. And I was getting to a point where I liked the story, and that felt super great. Anyway, I won't bore you with the minutiae of typing and editing and stuff like that. But the only other noteworthy thing that happened during this point was every time I got to a new part of the story, I had to slightly change my process. For example, Act 1, I just kind of knew the story and I just had to write it really fast. And when I got to Act 2, I started needing to outline more. So I started making these crazy block diagrams. I would do this first before I started writing a chapter. I've redacted a bunch of stuff. Not all of it is a spoiler, some of it is just because I want to be mysterious. So anyway, writing the middle part of the story felt different, like I needed to use more parts of my brain, and I needed to think about what was coming up and about what had been written already, and it just felt so much more complicated. Towards the middle, I found myself leaning on the outlines I'd made years and years ago, even that Discovery draft from way back in 2020, a whole lot more, so that was super fun. As I got closer to the end, I had a couple of different ways the story could go, and because I was making so much progress and kind of exhilarated by all of this, I had some confidence that the end was going to be to my satisfaction, but I didn't know for sure. And so that was a little nerve-wracking. I was like, wow, I'm going to keep writing and see where this goes, and gosh, I hope I like the end. I think I might because I liked the beginning and I liked the middle. Hopefully that trend will hold. Around this time I actually had a real deadline. I booked an editor and she had an expected start date, And I thought I'd given myself a whole lot of time, but I slowed down in the middle when I realized how much time I had. And maybe I slowed down a bit too much, so I had to pick up and speed up towards the end. And so by the end, I kind of wished I had like 1 or 2 more days not to worry about keeping my editor waiting. But anyway, it happened. I got to the end. I was happy with it. I was super excited and pleased with myself. I was so smug. You would think no one had ever written a novel before with how pleased I was with myself. That has faded a bit, but I still feel pretty good about this project. I started it in March 2020, if you only count actual drafting, and I finished it in April 2024 in terms of drafting. And so then it went to my editor. She gave it back in a month. Now it's with beta readers, so there will be some editing to do when they get back to me. And then it'll be time to think about the cover and illustrations and publication and all that sort of thing. And so it definitely feels like this project is in a whole new phase. And it's kind of crazy to think back on 4 years spent drafting. Though, to be fair, mostly in the winter. I think it's because I had the idea in winter, and also because my story starts in fall and winter. So, I don't know what that's about. Maybe the nip in the air puts me back in the headspace of when I first had the idea. It'll be interesting to see what happens this winter. Maybe I'll start the sequel. Anyway, I will be back at some point with something. Thanks for following along. Bye.